Fold each side 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch and then shimmy it underneath the center section of the pin. And now, just like using the bias tape maker tool that was shown previously, you can slowly pull the fabric through that section of the pin. You just have to kind of adjust the folds as you go to make sure that that seam allowance is maintained, and continue pressing until you've gone all the way across the entire strip of bias tape. We're going to repeat these steps to make the narrower width of bias tape as well, which will be cut at 3.5 centimeters or 1 3/8 inch. This will be used for finishing the neckline, the ruffle sleeve, and the hem of the shirt. I personally find it easier for these steps to press only one side of the bias tape, and so we're going to press that seam allowance at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, and that is with the wrong sides together. This way, when we sew the neckline, the hem, and the edge of the ruffle sleeve, we can sew the not folded side in the seam allowance and then wrap it around the raw edge and have the pre-folded side as the second stitch line. We're going to finish the raw edge of the seam allowance around the armhole using our 4.5 centimeter or 1 3/4 inch wide bias tape. So I'm wrapping it around the armhole to find about how long it is. I'm going to cut it with about a 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter overlap. Starting at the underarm side seam, we are going to pin our bias tape to the seam allowance, matching up the raw edges. Pin one section at a time, adjusting the bias tape as you go around the armhole. I'm pinning my bias tape on the inside of the armhole, so I'm technically pinning it to the sleeve fabric, and pin all the way around until you reach the end. You're going to want to start sewing about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters past the end of the bias tape. Leave that tail until we finish at the end and start sewing all the way around with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance, which will be right inside that fold of the bias tape. When you need to adjust the fabric around the presser foot, make sure to sink the needle so that the fabric doesn't shift under the foot. Rotate the sleeve around the presser foot and then continue sewing. When we reach the end, we're going to sew right up to the edge of where we started sewing, and then we're going to match up those tails of bias tape and sew them together vertically. At this point, you should have a continuous loop of bias tape all the way around your armhole. We are now going to tuck the raw edges of the bias tape inside, enclosing the raw edge of the seam allowance as well, and wrap that bias tape all the way around and pin it in place to the seam allowance. We're going to pin it all the way around the armhole so that the bias tape is enclosing all raw edges. And when we sew, we're going to use a 6 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance so that our stitch line is on the seam allowance and doesn't interfere with the actual sleeve. Now you have a perfectly heirloom finished armhole, and it will be very sturdy for lots of wear. Now we're going to prepare the ruffle sleeve. If you sewed the T-sleeve, you can go ahead and skip forward past the ruffle sleeve steps. Using your 3.5 centimeter or 1 3/8 inch wide narrower bias tape, we're going to place right sides together with the non-folded side around the curved edge of the ruffle sleeve. Trim away the excess bias tape and then sew along the edge of the bias tape with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. With the wrong side of the ruffle sleeve facing up, we're going to turn the bias binding over so that the seam allowance of the ruffle sleeve is folded and the bias binding is laying flat. We're going to iron this, turning the seam allowance of the ruffle sleeve over all the way around that curved edge, pressing it in place until we reach the end of the ruffle sleeve piece. Next, we're going to fold the bias tape again. This time we're going to wrap the fold of the bias tape around the seam allowance to enclose any of the frayed raw edges. Press it in place and then clip, and we're going to edge stitch along the edge of the bias tape. And here, just sew as close as you can to that edge of the bias tape. Increase your stitch length, then sew 2 parallel rows of gathering stitches on the straight edge of your ruffle sleeve. Keep your gathering stitches within the seam allowance by first sewing at 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch, and then again at 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the first row. Don't forget not to backstitch at the beginning or end of your stitches and leave a long tail of thread for gathering. We're going to gather the ruffle sleeve to fit between the 2 dots on the bodice, 1 dot at the back arm side and 1 dot at the front arm side. First line up the center notch on the ruffle sleeve to the shoulder notch, then align the front notch and the back notch and the ends of the ruffle at the dots on the arm side. Change your stitch length back to the standard stitch setting and then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. You can adjust the gathers in place as you sew to make sure that they are even and looking nice, and then just adjust the armhole around the presser foot, and you're just wanting to make sure that the layers of fabric are laying flat and smooth as they sew underneath the foot. The fabric that I'm using frays a lot, so I'm just trimming away some of those frayed threads so that when we do the bias tape, it will enclose it nice and neatly. Pin the bias binding to the armhole with the raw edges aligned. You want the non-folded side to be aligned with the raw edge. Pin the bias tape all the way around the armhole, then leave about a 1-inch tail of overlap at the end of the bias tape. Pin the tails together so that it is perfectly matched at the underarm, and then we're going to sew the ends of the bias tape together so it's the exact length of around the arm side. Pin the bias tape to the underarm and sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance around the armhole. We're going to wrap the bias tape around the seam allowance of the arm side, fold it twice over the seam allowance, and roll the seam allowance to the inside of the shirt so it is not seen at all from the outside. We will continue doing the double fold all the way around the arm side, pinning it in place. Then we will sew the bias binding by edge stitching as close as possible to that edge of the bias binding. Make sure that there are no pinches, folds, the stitches are even, because this will be visible from the outside of the bodice. Moving on to the button loops, we are going to fold the side in with the wrong sides together at 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch, and measure folding and pressing as you go all the way across the long side. And then we can rotate it and do the same on the opposite side. Again, folding inward with wrong sides together at 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch, and press all the way along until you create a mini bias tape. Now we are going to fold it again lengthwise to create a long skinny strand and fully enclose all of the raw edges. Again, you can fold it in half, pressing along as you go, and after ironing all the way across, setting the fold in place, we can use clips or pins and bring it over to the sewing machine. Sew lengthwise across the button loop piece, edge stitching as close as you can to the edge of the fabric. Next, using our measuring tape, we're going to cut our button loop piece into 3 even sections, which will make it 6.5 centimeters or 2.5 inches each. If one section ends up just a tad longer, you can snip off the end to make it even with the other 2. Fold the button loop in half and match up the ends, but make sure that the ends are laying flat so that we can sew them onto the bodice. Pin the button loop with the raw ends meeting the raw edge of the neckline, and pin in place at the 3 markings for the button loop. Stitch in place using a 6 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here I'm using my seam ripper just to help hold the button loops in place so that they don't separate or shift while I'm sewing. You could also use tweezers or chopsticks or a pen, a pencil, just to help hold it in place so that you don't get your finger too close to the needle. Using the 3.5 centimeter or 1 3/8 inch wide bias tape, we're going to pin our bias tape with the non-folded side on the neckline, aligning the raw edges, and we're going to pin it all the way from the hem up around the curve of the neckline and down to the other side of the hem. Sew the bias binding in place using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Push the fold to the side to make sure that it doesn't get caught under the needle or sewn into the bias tape. Next, we are going to press the bias tape flat from the outside of the bodice all the way around the neckline. Turn the bodice inside out so that you're now looking at the inside of the center front of the bodice. Unfold the bias tape and wrap the fold of the bias tape around the seam allowance so that the bias tape is fully folded to the inside of the garment. This should not be visible at all from the outside of the bodice. Continue wrapping, folding, and pressing all the way around the center front and the neckline and pinning in place. If the iron removed some of your markings for the waist channels, now is a good time to fill it back in with your heat erase pen. Sew the bias tape in place by edge stitching as close as you can to the edge of the bias tape all the way around the center front and the neckline. The bodice has a curved hem, so we're going to use our bias tape to finish the hemline using the narrower bias tape at 3.5 centimeters or 1 3/8 inch wide. Start your bias tape 1.5 centimeters beyond the center front. Pin the bias tape with right sides together and the not folded raw edge along the raw edge of the hem of the bodice. And then you can cut the end of the bias tape 1.5 centimeters beyond the center front. Sew the bias tape using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Be sure to unfold the bias tape so that the fold doesn't get caught under the needle or sewn into the seam line. First, we are going to press the bias tape away from the bodice so that it lays flat, and then we are going to unfold the bias tape, wrap the bias tape around the shirt seam allowance, and fold it under so that the bias tape is fully enclosed to the inside of the garment. Press across the entire hem and pin in place. To finish the corner, fold the tail of the bias tape over the center front and fold in the seam allowance corner. Then we're going to fold the bias tape over itself, press the corner neat, and pin in place, and then we will be ready to sew. Finish the hem of the bodice by edge stitching as close as you can to the edge of the bias tape. Be sure to back tack well at either end. The next step is to place the waist channels. We're going to use the wider bias tape that we made at 4.5 centimeters or 1 3/4 inches wide. Start with your bias tape 12 millimeters or 1/2 inch beyond the center front. Place the bias tape in between the lines marked for the waist channels and pin all the way across the bodice until you've reached the opposite center front. Cut the end of the bias tape 12 millimeters or 1/2 inch beyond the center front. Repeat the same steps for the second waist channel. Fold the end of the bias tape 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch and press, then fold again 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch, press and pin, and then we are going to edge stitch that in place. Repeat these steps for all 4 ends of the waist channels. But now we are going to sew the waist channels in place by edge stitching as close as we can to the edge of the bias tape. We will do this all the way across the first waist channel and then across the bottom of the waist channel, and we will repeat this step on the second waist channel as well until they are all sewn into place. If you used a heat erase pen like I did to mark the waist channels, this part is super fun because you get to watch them disappear as you iron the waist channels flat and smooth. Now we can sew our waist ties. These are cut at 4.5 centimeters or 1 3/4 inches wide, and you can find the length of the waist ties for your size in the pattern booklet. The sides of the waist ties are folded in, wrong sides together at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch and pressed. And then we fold it in half lengthwise and press it and pin. And we're going to sew it to create the waist ties. We're first going to unfold the end of the waist tie, and we're going to fold it with right sides together, pin it, and then sew the end with a 6 millimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you can trim that seam allowance down, turn the waist tie back right side out, and use something pointy to press in the corner of the waist tie. Then fold in the raw edges and press it into the corner, and you're ready to sew. Edge stitch along the edge of the waist tie all the way across the entire length, and then repeat for the second waist tie. Place a safety pin on the end of the waist tie and use it to feed the waist tie through the waist channel. Move the safety pin through by pushing it, scrunching up the fabric, and then pulling, and you continue pushing it through until you reach the opposite end and can pull out the safety pin. Repeat these steps with the second waist tie through the other waist channel, and then pulling out the tails of the waist ties, you can adjust the gathers until the waist tie is even on both sides. The last step for completing the bodice is sewing on the buttons. I'm going to show you how to make fabric covered buttons to match your dress. If you are using standard buttons, you can go ahead and skip forward and just sew the buttons into place. I'm using a self-cover button kit, and the buttons are 1.5 centimeters wide or 5/8 inch diameter, and we're going to cut circles of our fabric at a 3 centimeter diameter or 1 1/4 inch. Cut 3 of these circles to make 3 buttons. Place your circle in the center of the silicone mold with the right side facing down, and take the top part of the button and place it on top of the fabric circle and press it into the mold. And then press in the edges of the fabric, place the back on top, and use the pusher to press the button into the mold. It can be a little tricky to get the button out of the mold, but pull it out and then you are ready to sew it onto the bodice. Using the button markings from the pattern, sew a few stitches onto the fabric first and then begin sewing on your button. You want to make sure that you're sewing onto a little bit of the bias tape just to make sure that the fabric is thick and secure enough to hold a button. After sewing a few loops, you can sew on the button. I would sew maybe 7 or 8 times around the button, and then afterward I always loop thread around the base of the button to help it stand straight and be secure, and then I tie off a knot and you can snip the thread. Now your bodice is complete. You could technically stop here and keep it as a shirt, but I will move on with the video and show you how to make the entirety of the dress.